Hey everybody, welcome in everybody. Again, this is Midnight Book Club. We're reading from Unexplained by Jerome Clark, and tonight we're learning about the modern history of fairies and fairy sightings. So it's going to be an out there one. All right, so fairies. As he walked down an isolated country road near Barron, Wisconsin, one summer night in 1919, 13-year-old Harry Anderson saw something distinctly odd. 20 little men trooped in single file and heading in his direction were visible in the bright moonlight. Even as they passed him, they paid him no attention. Young Anderson noticed they were dressed in leather knee pants held up by suspenders. They wore no shirts, they were bald, and their skin was pale white. Though they were all making mumbling sounds, they did not appear to be communicating with each other. Terrified, Anderson continued on his way and did not look back. The bizarre encounter remained vivid in his memory for the rest of his life. So there we go. Our first fairy encounter here in 1919. A young Mr. Anderson encounters what seems like to be a group of Keebler elves, as they're described, or as like we popularly see them, right? Like these guys. Well, these ones are a little more edgy. They're in leather overalls and they're all bald, which is interesting. And the mumbling, you'll see as we read on to more fairy sightings, the mumbling and the weird language is a common trope or a common theme found in them. To Americans, indeed to most people in the modern Western world, fairies are no more than figments of the sentimental imagination, suitable only for children's entertainment, in which they are portrayed almost invariably as tiny, winged, and good-hearted. This version of the fairy is rooted in romantic literature, not in worldwide folk traditions, in which beliefs concerning hidden races that share the earth with us have resided for most of human history. And there we go, our intro into fairies. So welcome everybody tonight to Cryptid Tales. And as you just tasted our subject for tonight, it is fairies and the sightings and history of them. As always, as I'm reading, if my stories or what we're reading jogs any memories of yours, any encounters you might have had, any encounters your family might have had, any stories you might have had of the unknown or the paranormal, please let me know, because as always,
we're ready to believe you.
And I want to hear those stories. All right, so let's continue. Let's keep going here with traditions, the tradition and its mysteries, or the fairy tradition and its mysteries. A century ago, Harry Anderson, who knew no more than that the figures he encountered were strange in the extreme, would have had little doubt about their identity. This would be especially true if he had lived in a Celtic country whose roads, rocks, caves, fields, rivers, lakes, and forests, so common opinion attested, were infested with entities of such volatile temperament that only the unwise or unwary called them fairies, for they did not like to hear their proper name spoken. Because one of them could be listening at any time, rural people employed various euphemisms such as the good people, the gentry, or the honest folk, or the fair tribe, and others, calculated to praise rather than to risk offense. As the Reverend Robert Kirk, a 17th century chronicler of the fairy faith, wrote, "The Irish bless all they fear harm of." Makes sense, right? You're not sure what to bless, is bless it all. But interesting. The different names for it, that is that lore where they don't like being called fairies. That's funny. The fairy faith populated the world with a bewildering variety of entities, even within a single region. Nonetheless, fairies could be counted on to be more or less human in form, though sometimes taller or shorter, never, however, bearing wings, and much of their behavior was recognizably human. They had governments, societies, divisions of labor, art, music, and conflicts. They married, had children, waged war, and died. At the same time, they possessed supernatural powers that made them at best unpredictable and at worst dangerous. Few people sought out the company of fairies, and most went out of their way to avoid it. The origins of the fairy faith are obscure and by now unknowable. Folklorists and anthropologists have theorized that the original fairies were members of conquered races who took to the hills and whose descendants were sighted on rare occasions, to be mistaken for supernatural beings. It is also suggested that fairies were remnants of the old gods and spirits whom Christianity displaced, but who survived in popular belief as immaterial beings of lesser rank than God and the Holy Ghost. Some writers have suggested that the fairy faith is all that remains of an ancient cult of the dead. Indeed, the dead sometimes were said to appear in the company of fairies. A fashionable modern view, expressed by Alan Bruford, holds that fairies represent an anthropomorphic form of the mysterious and numinous in wild nature, the part of the world which is beyond mankind's understanding. And that makes perfect sense. It's kind of like when you read the history of a lot of this stuff, like the occult or witchcraft or demonology, it all depends on the region and what the beliefs were at the time, and whatever that may be, that society subscribes their ascribes their paranormal beliefs to, match up with the beliefs that society has. So if the fairy faith was a big thing in, Celtic countries, Ireland, Scotland, UK, and all that fun stuff, then it's no small wonder that when weird things would happen. Oh, that was a fairy that got me. I saw that. These were these fairies that I saw. What gets interesting is when you have sightings of these types of creatures that are described, or entities that are described, that aren't in countries that have like a rich fairy tradition, but they still match the same descriptions as creatures seen in countries that have a fairy religion or, a fairy tradition. It's just interesting. Aside from the speculations of scholars, folk explanation, especially in Christian countries, is often associated fairies with fallen angels. All that is known with any certainty is that wherever they come from, fairy beliefs exist in every traditional society. Fairies figure most prominently in myths, legends, and tales that folklorists have collected in the field or uncovered in archaic printed sources. One of the great early studies was Robert Kirk's The Commonwealth in 1691. Kirk, a Presbyterian clergyman who served in Scotland's Highlands and who had a keen interest in the supernatural lore of the region, was convinced of the reality of fairies. After all, he asked, how could such a widespread belief, even if not the 10th part true, yet could not spring of nothing? He conducted his inquiries on the assumption that once he had enough information, he could accurately describe the nature of fairy life down to its smallest details. According to Kirk, fairies were in the middle nature between man and angel, with bodies somewhat of the nature of a condensed cloud. They dressed and spoke like the people and country under which they lived. Sometimes passing, fairies could be heard but not seen. They traveled often, frequently through the air. They could steal anything they liked and had no particular religion. Mortals with second sight or clairvoyance were most likely to see them, since they were usually invisible to the human eye. In fact, the word fairy comes from a much earlier word of fairy, which meant a state of enchantment rather than an individual supernatural entity. That makes a lot more sense as far as being the word fairy being based on a state of enchantment or an altered state. It makes me think of when people report DMT entities, when people have done DMT. I have unfortunately never had the experience, but people take DMT and they report seeing these entities, and they're all usually the same, described as little clockwork elves. And that makes me think of fairy sightings and how they're described. They're very human-like in the descriptions people have of them, and they encounter these beings when they're in an altered state, and they believe their consciousness maybe even travels to an alternate dimension or alternate state of our own reality, where these things can be seen, kind of like a realm right beyond ours. Could be the same types of creatures that these people are reporting in fairy sightings. Who knows? but that is a parallel. That does, when I'm reading that, I am thinking of that exact thing, of the DMT Clockwork Elves. When Kirk talks about a middle nature between man and angel, kind of like the spiritual realm or the other realm of consciousness, it makes me think of this book I'm reading right now called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. It's about understanding consciousness, written by the scientist Itzov. I'll put his name up in his picture. But it was the book the CIA used to base their Gateway program on, and it's all about understanding consciousness and the levels of consciousness and how there are different realms of it. So a lot of the times these creatures or experiences people have, they kind of line up with being in an altered state. You know, your mind or consciousness being in an altered state, like being in a different realm just through your consciousness. So that makes me think about these fairy sightings and how they seem so invisible to some people. Might be something more like that. They might just be there, just on the other side, just on the other side of the veil. Few modern scholars have admitted to belief in fairies. The major exception was W.Y. Evans Wentz, author of the well-regarded The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, originally published in 1911. Evans Wentz, an anthropologist of religion with a PhD from Oxford University, traveled through the British Isles and Brittany on France's northwest coast and reported the results in a thick book that remains a classic of folklore studies. Besides documenting what remained of an oral tradition of fairy belief, the author, who was also interested in Eastern religion and Western occultism, declared, "We can postulate scientifically on the showing of the data of physical research the existence of such invisible intelligences as gods, genii, demons, all kinds of true fairies, and disembodied men." So this guy's saying, again, through physics and through science, we could prove the other realms. We could prove that other creatures exist in these other realms. Getting visions of Death Note in my head. The Death Note demon hung out. Just another realm just right beyond ours, right? But even those possessed of the will to make this leap of faith, not a small one, usually find themselves brought up short by the fact that when considered in their entirety, fairy traditions are too wildly complex, various, and fantastic to add up to anything coherent. Well, I think that is also because humans add a lot of their own meaning and own complexity to this stuff. We make it way more complex than it probably actually is when we write things like reports on fairies. We're talking about stuff we don't even know. And stuff we can't even understand. If it truly is on the other side of consciousness, there's no way we're going to be able to wrap our minds around it. Us just saying they have societies or government or they act like us. If anything, these are projections of our own consciousness, and the entities show themselves as something we will actually be comfortable with. It's not the other way around. But I digress. As one reads the vast literature of fairy lore, one thinks more readily on the vagaries of the human imagination than of the mysteries of the invisible world. Moreover, anyone willing to embrace fairies also has to entertain the possibility, from evidence not a lot worse, that gods, mermaids, giants, shape-shifting monsters, werewolves, vampires, and other folkloric creatures may exist. Common sense warns us it may be better to draw the line sooner than later. That's true. But also, I like to believe the truth always lands somewhere in the middle, no matter what it is. So of all these stories, all this evidence, all this kind of circumstantial evidence and eyewitness accounts, they all add up to something. Something is out there. It might not be as fantastic or as weird as some of the theories might state, but I definitely do not think it's absolutely nothing or purely just in our own minds, like a hallucination or a mass hysteria that a lot of skeptics think. I think it's got to be somewhere in the middle. Yet mysteries remain. Even if these do not amount to evidence for the ultra extraordinary and innately unbelievable claim that a fairy realm exists, they do not necessarily reduce to simple answers either. People see or think they see all kinds of strange things. And among the strange things people think they see are fairies. These sightings continue even in the absence of an accompanying fairy faith, as Harry Anderson's story indicates. It is probable that in traditional societies, fairies were believed in, at least in part because they were seen. Fairies did not exist, in other words, solely in stories. They also existed in what were believed to be experiences. As the great Irish folklorist Douglas Hyde wrote, the folktale must not be confused with the folk belief. The story is something much more intricate, complicated, and thought out than the belief. One can quite easily distinguish between the two. The belief is short, conversational, chiefly relating to real people, and contains no great sequence of incidents, much like the sighting that was in the beginning of our story, right? That young Anderson boy who saw the troop of little men walking through the woods. While the other, the folk tale, is long, complicated, and more or less conventional, and above all, has its interests grouped around a central figure, that of the hero or heroine. What Hyde calls beliefs, others would call sightings. Yeah, that does make sense. To Evans Wentz, to the poet W.B. Yeats, and to the modern occult historian Leslie Shepard, these sightings suffice to establish the existence of a fairy world located in a kind of fourth dimension or parallel reality, which we're studying now that parallel realities and other dimensions do exist. To folklorists such as Stuart Sanderson and Catherine Briggs, sightings are shrugged off and passed on without further printed reflection. To parapsychologists, who for their part have shown approximately zero interest in the question, which is a bummer. The behavioral scientist David J. Hufford, a radical skepticism, which sees even scientific attempts to explain supernatural beliefs as contaminated by unexamined cultural prejudices that may themselves be no more than expressions of faith, demands that we acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge of some aspects of human experience. In a critique of academic literature that seeks to debunk testimony about anomalous encounters, Hufford writes, "One readily finds appeals to authority, post hoc fallacies, and ad hominem arguments, and a whole host of other informal errors. Nonetheless, because of this inductive dimension of the work of framing questions and establishing the boundaries of scholarly discourse about the supernatural, were largely set anywhere from several generations ago to a number of centuries ago. The systematic bias of the tradition operates almost invisibly today." So basically, our man Hufford is saying that it's a behavior thing. Once it gets established that it's ridiculous to study something, everybody jumps on board with that, and then there's no more real academic study done to it or done with it. In short, no explanation, whether conventionally credulous or skeptical, that purports to offer a blanket explanation for these accounts answers all the questions in a wholly convincing fashion. Even if we do not understand the underlying causes, be they psychological or paranormal, of these stories, there is nothing to stop us from marveling at them as simply as stories. For now, after all, that is all we can do with them. So now we're going to jump into some of those stories, and we're going to look at the parallels and themes of them, and you're going to see a lot. They all kind of run together, just like with the encounters people have with off-world beings, or the ones people have been having lately, or the ones we've been reading about at least. And I'm talking about Flatwoods, Hopkinsonville, and the alien Vegas encounter, or the Vegas alien encounter, sorry. Where bright lights, something lands, and then a family has an encounter with a being that might or might not have come from the craft that they saw land. In fairy sightings, it's much of the same. Diminutive-sized people speaking a language we don't understand that seem very human. And we'll see that in these stories. So, sightings and hearings. One example of the kinds of first-hand accounts folklorists collected while the fairy faith still lived was related to Lady Campbell by an old blind Irish farmer. The farmer claimed that some years earlier he had captured a fairy, a 2-foot-high creature wearing a red cap, green clothes, and boots, and having dark but clear complexion. "I gripped him close in my arms and took him home," the farmer related. "I called to the woman, his wife, to look at what I had got. 'What doll is this you have there?' she cried. 'A living one,' I said, and put it on the dresser. We feared to lose it, so we kept the door locked. It talked and muttered to itself weird words. It might have been near a fortnight since we had the fairy, when I said to the woman, "Sure, if we show it to the great city, we will be made up rich." So we put it in a cage at night, and we would leave the cage door open, and we would hear it stirring through the house. We fed it on bread and rice and milk out of a cup at the end of a spoon. Soon, however, the fairy escaped. Not long afterwards, the man lost his sight, the couple's fortunes further declined, a situation he blamed on the fairy retribution. Another earlier fairy tale, so there you go, don't mess with the fairies. Those seem to be the main stories with the fairies that we're running into, or at least this first one so far. Don't mess with them. Don't call them fairies. They don't like it. They don't like being insulted. Don't try and capture them, or you'll get yourself a little fairy curse. Then even earlier episode but it had a happier ending. The following is the text of a sworn statement by a 17th century Swedish clergyman, P. Rom. So this is an encounter him and his wife had with a fairy couple. In the year 1660, when I and my wife had gone to my farm, which is 3/4 of a mile from Ragunda Personage, and we were sitting there and talking a while late in the evening, there came a little man at the door, who begged my wife to go and aid his wife, who was just in the pains of labor. The fellow was of small size and of dark complexion, and dressed in old gray clothes. My wife and I sat a while and wondered at the man, for we are aware that he was a troll, and that we had heard tell that such like called by the peasantry spirits always used to keep them in farmhouses when people left them in harvest time. But when he had urged his request 4 or 5 times, and we thought on what evil country folks say, that they have at times suffered from the spirits when they have chanced to swear at them, or with uncivil words bid them to go to hell, I took the resolution to read some prayers over my wife and bless her, and bid her in God's name to go with him. She took in haste some old linen with her, and went along with him, and I remained sitting there. When she returned, she told me that when she went with the man out at the gate, it seemed to her as if she was carried for a time along the wind, and so she came to a room, on one side of which was a little dark chamber, in which his wife lay in a bed in great agony. My wife went up to her, and after a little while aided her till she brought forth a child, after the same manner as other human beings. The man then offered her food, and when she refused, he thanked her and accompanied her out, and then she was carried along in the same way in the wind, and after a while came again to the gate, just at 10 o'clock. Meanwhile, a quantity of old pieces and clippings of silver were laid on a shelf in the sitting room, and my wife found them the next day, when she was putting the room in order. It is supposed that they were laid there by the spirits. That in truth so happened. I witnessed by inscribing my name, Ragunda, the 12th of April, 1671. So a sworn statement. That kind of sounds like a modern day alien abduction story. You're whisked away, and all of a sudden you're in a room and you're helping out with a medical experiment. But in our times, it's more you are the medical experiment. But interesting parallels with an alien abduction story. That was all the way in 1671. So that was a sworn statement from Swedish clergyman P. Rom. Mary Sidon of Wales told a folklorist of her own early 20th century experience with a fairy family. One moonlit night, she related she, her husband, and their children heard a knocking at the door as they sat by the fire. The callers proved to be a tiny man, woman, and baby. The tallest of them, the man, was only 2 feet high. I should be thankful for the loan of a bowl and water and coal of fire, the woman said. I should like to wash this little child. I do not want them at once. We shall come again after you have gone to bed. Mrs. Scion left the requested materials before she and her family retired. During the night, they could hear the comings and goings of the little people, and in the morning, the family found everything in order except for the bowl, which lay upside down. Underneath it, the family found 4 shillings. So if you're, it's kind of like these stories, this lore, this folklore. It's about helping people out. Help a stranger out. You get some shillings in it, hopefully. Edward Williams, a prominent 18th century British cleric, wrote that in 1757, when he was 7 years old, he and other children were playing in a field in Wales when they saw at a distance of 100 yards 7 or 8 tiny couples dressed in red, each carrying a white handkerchief in his or her hand. One of the little men chased the children and nearly caught one, who, according to Williams, got a full and clear view of his ancient, swarthy, grim complexion. Just before effecting his escape, during the chase, another of the figures shouted at the pursuer in an unknown language. The incident puzzled Dr. Williams all his life, and he concluded, "I am forced to class it among my unknowables." The Reverend Sabine Baring Gould, the Victorian historian and folklorist, wrote that when he was 4 years old and traveling in a carriage with his parents, "I saw legions of dwarves of about 2 feet high running along besides the horses. Some sat laughing on the pole. Some were scrambling up the harness to get on the backs of the horses. His parents saw nothing." Baring Gould also recorded an encounter with his wife experience when she was 15 and walking down a lane in Yorkshire. There she spotted a little green man, perfectly well made, who looked at her with his beady black eyes. She was so frightened that she ran home. Fairy sightings evidently ran in the family. One of his sons had gone to fetch pea pods in the garden when he informed his parents that he observed a little man wearing a red cap and a green jacket and broken knee breeches, whose face was old and wan, and who had a gray beard and eyes as black and as hard as soles. He stared so intently at the boy that the latter took to his heels. That is just like the mermaid sighting that the British explorer ship had around the same time, in the mid 19th century, where these sailors are going along and they see what they believe to be a merman, and the whole crew is looking at it, and the merman, or whatever this creature is, swims up, turns around, and just stares at the boat so deeply and darkly that the sailors, they turn around. They literally they turn the boat around and they go the other way. This little gnome or fairy creature had the same effect on this boy. Stared him down till he ran. But here we go. We're getting into more modern-ish times. Okay. Now let's jump all the way here to 1973. Over a century later, on April 30th, 1973, an educated London woman named Mary Treadgold was traveling by bus through the Highlands near the town of Mull. The bus pulled over to the side of a narrow road to let an oncoming car pass by, and Treadgold idly looked out the window to an expanse of peat, or like a big field. There, standing in front of a clump of heather, stood a small figure about 18 inches high, a young man with his foot on a spade, in the act of digging, she reported. He had a thin, keen face with tight brown curly hair and was dressed in a bright blue bib and braces, with a very white shirt with rolled up sleeves. An open sack, also miniature, stood at his side. Sounds like a little treasure goblin. He also, empathetically, was not a dwarf nor a child, nor a plastic garden gnome. He was a perfectly formed living being, like any of us, only in miniature. The figure was lost to view after the bus resumed its journey. When I got home, Treadgold wrote, I inquired from a Highland acquaintance, who told me friends of hers had seen similar small people on the mole, and that the mole was known for this. She added, the small people were generally pale, I don't recall this particularly, and very bright. This last I do recollect, the brightness of the hair and clothes, and the general appearance of energy and alertness. On occasion, folklore collectors have had experiences consistent with local fairy manifestations. Sir Walter Scott complained of an educated correspondent who, though a scholar and a gentleman, had confessed that frequently he had seen the impression of small feet among the snow, and once thought I heard a whistle as though in my ear when nobody could make it was near me. Scott laid these presumed delusions to the contagious effect of superstitious atmosphere. Waldron, the correspondent, had lived so long among the Celtic people that he was almost persuaded to believe their legends. John Cuthbert Lawson, who studied turn-of-the-century Royal Greek traditions, including beliefs in tall fairy women known as their Nereides, remarked on the wonderful agreement among the witnesses in the description of their appearance and dress. I myself once had a Nereid pointed out to me by my guide, and there certainly was a semblance of a female figure draped in white and tall beyond human stature, sitting in the dusk between the gnarled and twisted boles of an old olive yard. What the apparition was, I had no leisure to investigate, for my guide, with many signs of the cross and muttered invocations of the Virgin, ordered my mule to perilous haste along the rough mountain path. Many people also claim to hear fairy music. Manx fiddler William Kane swore he heard music emanating from a brightly lit glass palace that he encountered one night in a mountain glen. He stopped and listened and then went home and learned the tune and thereafter performed it widely. In the summer of 1922, while sitting on the banks of the Tean River in Dartmoor, England, composer Thomas Wood heard a strange voice calling him by his first name. Though he searched the fields, he could find no source. Then he heard overhead, faint as breath, then even louder, music in the air. It lasted 20 minutes. He told writer Harold T. Wilkins, portable wireless sets were unknown in 1922. This music was essentially harmonic, not a melody nor an air. It sounded like the weaving together of tenuous fairy sounds. Listening intently, he wrote down the notes. In 1972, while strolling along the shore of a peninsula in Scotland's Western Highlands, American folk singer Artie Traum heard disembodied voices chanting, "Run, man, run," in a strange harmony to the sound of fiddles and pipes. When Traum fled into the nearby woods, he heard crackling sounds and great motion. All the while, he recalled, my head was swarming with thousands of voices, thousands of words, making no sense. The voices ceased once he found his way back to the open air. Ooh, that's a good one. Though nearly extinct elsewhere in the West, the fairy faith, in its most traditional form, lives on in Iceland, where a University of Iceland survey a few years ago indicated that as much as 55% of the population considers the reality of elves, or hidden people, certain, probable, or possible, and only 10% rejects the notion flatly as out of the question. Belief is so strong that construction and road projects are sometimes delayed to accommodate the wishes of the invisible folk who dwell in the fields, forests, rocks, and harbors. In such cases, psychics are called in to negotiate. As with other fairies, the entities are not always invisible to normal perception. A 1990 Wall Street Journal article observes that humans and the hidden folk usually get on well. Midwives have told folklorist Harold Erickson about delivering elf babies. Farmers say they have milked elf cows. Sometimes two people fall in love, though affairs of the heart often end badly. You know, the belief in invisible folk that dwell in the fields of rocks and live in the forest or whatever, if it causes projects to pause and put respect on nature, is it really that bad of a thing to do that? To slow down the chewing progress of the West that likes to just, make towns, churn out factories, cities, whatever it may be. Maybe it's nice to take a little break, ask for permission from Mother Nature, pray to entities that may or may not exist, just so it takes a little more time. But those were fairy sightings up until the 1970s and even 1990 with the Wall Street Journal article on them. Next, we're going to talk about fairies or humanoids. What are they? In 1938, Dublin's Irish press reported watching for fairies has leaped into sudden popularity in West Limerick. There, a number of men and boys said they had seen groups of fairies and even chased them to no avail. They jumped into the ditches as fast as a greyhound, one witness said. All the while, though they passed through hedges, ditches, and marshes, they appeared neat and clean all the time. The figures had hard, hairy faces like men and no ears. The excitement began when a schoolboy named John Keeley encountered a 2-foot tall man dressed in red clothing on the road. Asked where he was from, the gnome responded curtly, "I'm from the mountains, and it's all equal to you what my business is." The boy alerted his friends and acquaintances, who the next day returned with Keeley and hid in the bushes as he approached a company of fairies, letting one of them take his hand. They walked together for a short time until the fairies spotted the human beings in the bush and shot away. If this incident had occurred a decade later, or been reported somewhere other than Ireland, it probably would have been treated as an encounter with UFO occupants. In November 1959, according to the Belfast Telegraph, on November 9th, a man moving a large bush with a bulldozer on a farm in County Carlow was startled to see a 3-foot tall red man run out from underneath the machine, about 100 yards across the field, over a fence, and into the field adjoining. 3 other men observed the fleeing figure. Only the Irish locale kept this from being treated as a UFO incident, though no UFO was seen. Indeed, the UFO literature contains a handful of incidents in which someone conversant in the fairy faith might find familiar elements. In April 1950, Kenneth Arnold, whose much publicized June 24, 1947 sighting brought the UFO age into being, interviewed a Canby, Oregon woman, Ellen Jornerson, who recently had seen a 12-inch little man with dark features, a stocky build, and a plaid shirt walking with a waddling motion. He passed under a car and had disappeared. And you see in the West in 1950, that's a UFO incident. If it was Ireland, this would be an elf incident. So many similarities. Inevitably, some writers have suggested that the UFO phenomena and fairy manifestations are related, sometimes notably in debunker Robert Schaefer's sarcastic UFO verdict in 1981. The connection is made as a way of heaping ridicule on UFO reports. Other times, as in Jacques Vallée's Passport to Mangonia, which I need to get, 1969, it is made to support an occult view that assumes the reality of paranormal shape-shifting entities that can appear depending on the observer's preconceptions. So we're talking about your preconceptions in your own consciousness as fairies or extraterrestrials. More recent theorists, for example, Hilary Evans in Gods, Spirits, and Cosmic Guardians, 1987, another book we got to pick up, argue that all entity encounters occur in altered states of consciousness and are hallucinatory. But despite their surface attractiveness, theories like Evans are hardly more persuasive than Vallée's. Psychological approaches suffer from an absence of empirical evidence and are open to the sorts of criticisms David Hufford, who demands that we acknowledge the limitations of our own knowledge of some aspects of human experience, has made. In any case, links between UFO lore and fairy lore are weak and require the theorists to read the respective literatures with great selectivity. Folklorist Thomas E. Bullard calls proposed connections oblique and speculative at best, a point readers can easily establish for themselves by comparing the context of 2 books, coincidentally published the same year, 1976, Coral and Jim Lorenzen's Encounters with UFO Occupants, and Catherine Briggs's An Encyclopedia of Fairies. 2 more books we need for the collection. Another important difference is that at least some close encounters of the third kind have been well investigated and documented by civilian or official inquiries. Whereas fairy sightings, however provocative and no more than simple anecdotes, no doubt this is so because those who heard them saw no reason to investigate. Either they believed in fairies and so implicitly assumed the stories to be true, or they did not believe in fairies and so assumed the stories to be untrue, or they were collecting what they thought as folklore, whose reality status is irrelevant. In all these cases, no further inquiry was deemed necessary. Perhaps real investigation would turn belief or disbelief into a response based on information rather than on supposition, but fairy sightings are likely to remain where they always have been, at the fringes of the human experience. And that is the history of modern fairies and even some fairy sightings up until the 1970s. I hope you all enjoyed Midnight Book Club. Fairies, 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 history and sightings. I don't know, that was a wild one. If I have to go with, if we're talking like a believability factor here, and for me, I like to equate all these fairy encounters, UFO encounters, they parallel. So to me, they're one and the same. To me, I'm more lined up with Jacques Vallée's theory that we are projecting our own consciousness onto these entities, and that's why they appear as sometimes elves, sometimes gray aliens, ghosts, whatever it may be. They're appearing to us as what we are projecting onto them through our very powerful consciousness. That's where I'm at. And if I'm talking that, yes, right? I know. Yes, Strawberry, me too. I love talking about and learning about fairies and thinking about the possibility of entities from other realms. Because it is interesting that there are a lot of parallels in, let's say, gray alien sightings and fairy sightings. Both are diminutive creatures or entities that people see. They're not very big, and they're not harmful. They might do a weird experiment or ask for your help, but they're not generally harmful. So I think that goes with Jacques Vallée's theory about all these sort of entities, that they are probably entities from another realm, another dimension, whatever it may be, but how they appear to us is just from our own cultural norms and what our consciousness is projecting onto this entity for it to appear as something. Do I think it's just all in our heads? I don't know. But do I think these kind of entities from other realms exist? On the believability scale, we're going to have to go with, 85% for me. 85% these sorts of entities are out there in some way, and they're from another realm, a realm that's just beyond ours, another dimension, if you will. But that is the Midnight Book Club. I hope you all had a good time. Next, we're going to do some gaming, so stick around if you'd like to see what I'm going to play. I'm not even sure what I'm going to play yet. We're going to figure that out together.